In this video, we will show you how to make a BlackTail Studio project for less than $500 using simple woodworking fundamentals, tools, and easily obtainable materials such as ash and walnut. As I bring my material in and start the rough milling process, you may be asking why I need to build a BlackTail Studio project on a budget in the first place. My oldest son, who attends college in Philadelphia, has an off-campus apartment. As a college student, he has very little disposable income and needs some furniture, so he has turned to his woodworking father to provide him with some furniture on the cheap. And by cheap, he means free. With his birthday coming up, I figured I could kill two birds with one stone. At the hardwood dealer, I bought two 8-quarter by 9-foot long elm boards. Using chalk, I marked out the rough length I needed out of the two boards, which would then give me 4 boards that would make the width of the top. Bringing the boards to my miter station, I cut them down at the chalk marks. Boards ended up at about 8.5 inches wide, and as I placed them on my assembly table, I noticed they had a slight twist. Typically, I would remove the twist with my joiner, but I couldn't use that tool in this case. My joiner can handle boards up to 6 inches wide, but these were over 8 inches wide. Then inspiration hit. I looked up and saw a scrap piece of melamine, which was longer and wider than my ash pieces. More importantly, it was dead flat, so I grabbed the melamine, installed a stop for the boards, and had myself a crude flattening sled to run through my 13-inch planer. Once all the boards were flat, I continued my normal milling processes. While I do that, a little more background for this project. My son, like most of the internet, loves the content from the BlackTail Studio and sent me a link to the Mappa Burl Coffee Table project. It's a beautiful table, but for its size, it is one of Cam's priciest projects. And although my son is doing well in school, and I am very proud of him, he's not getting a super expensive and fancy coffee table. Also, I'm pretty sure that Mappa Burl is inappropriate for beer pong. After studying the video, I realized the table consists of 3 main pieces: the top, the shelf, and the legs. All 3 pieces could be made with several pieces glued up, and boy, do I know how to do a panel glue up. Once all the top pieces were milled, I had to join them together. For the top, I will be using dominoes. You could use biscuits or glue alone to join the boards as well. Later, I will show both of those methods for joining boards. But for the top, I chose dominoes and started milling the slots. Once the domino slots were milled, I could go on to the top and glue it up. I know watching me glue up the top is not the best content in the world, but it gives me a chance to tell you that there will be no plans for this build, and I have been very conscientious not to provide the final dimensions. The reason is this. This is Cam's design and his original project, and the point is to try to build it on a budget. If you want to make this coffee table, I will include the links to the BlackTail Studio project video and Cam's links for the plans for the table in the description below. You should check out his video. We all know he needs the views. Recently, I learned that most people watch woodworking videos for the entertainment rather than to build the content shown. That fact blew me away, and I'd like to change that. While the original project was a bit more expensive, and most people would not want to spend that much on a coffee table, using the materials I chose made the project accessible to more woodworkers, and it was a good skill builder as well. Panel glue-ups, milling and joinery, and making templates are excellent skills to have and improve on. So I hope some of you out there choose to build this project and not just watch it. I let the top sit in the clamps for a couple hours, then I removed the clamps. The top is not yet square, so I marked off a straight line, and then with my track saw, I cut one side. Now that I had one straight cut, I could take the top to the table saw and place that cut against the fence to make the other cuts to turn the top into a square. Now that the top is square, I began sanding the top, starting at 80 grit and going through all the grits to 220. With the top complete, I set it aside and began to work on the legs. The legs are made up of 2 boards of walnut joined together. Everyone knows you can't have a successful woodworking video without including walnut in your project, and I certainly don't want to buck that trend. When I went to my hardwood dealer, they didn't have the walnut boards in the width I needed for the legs. So instead, I found walnut boards a little over half of the width of the leg and bought double the amount to make the legs out of a 2-board glue-up. The milling process is the same as the top, with one exception. I could face joint the walnut on my jointer as it was less than the width of the tool, so I happily stowed my super simple flattening sled for use in another video. I seem to be saying walnut several times in this sequence. Maybe I'll be more successful. Kind of like saying Beetlejuice 3 times. Walnut, walnut, walnut. Since we're about halfway through the project and you're still with me, I hope you are getting some value out of this video. Maybe you learned something, or I made you laugh, or you're really just plain entertained. If so, I hope you hit the like, subscribe, and notify buttons. It really means a lot to me, and I genuinely appreciate the support. As promised, I will make the legs by gluing up 2 boards and using biscuits to align them. Using the biscuit joiner, I make a double row of biscuit slots. Because the biscuits are used to keep the boards aligned and not for strength, I thought a double row of biscuits would do the job. Now that the slots are cut, we begin the assembly of the legs. Just like the top of the coffee table, the leg glue up process is the same. Start by putting glue in the biscuit slots, then placing glue on the edges of the board. I then borrowed Jason Hibbs' patented glue spreader and covered the entire edges with glue. Insert the biscuits, align the 2 boards, and clamp it up. I repeat this process on all 4 legs, and once clamped, I set them aside to dry. I let the legs cook for a couple hours in the clamps, and when they were done, I removed the clamps and brought them over to the table saw, where I used my crosscut sled to cut the pieces down to their final size. I cut a little off of one end, slid it down to my stop, and then cut the other end. As with everything else in this project, once I completed one, I repeated the process on the remaining 3 legs. Each leg gets a slot cut in it, so I decided to make a jig to make sure all the slots were identical. I came over to my table saw, and underneath it I store these large MDF spacer blocks. Here is where I made a mistake I didn't catch immediately. The jig is meant to fit over the leg, and in the previous shot you saw positive stops on 3 sides. Yet when I begin laying out the slot, I am laying it out on the top, which means the distance from the edge will be wrong by the thickness of the stop. Layout Joe, oblivious to his future problems, begins by placing his spacer block and then a cutoff from the shelf for the width of the slot and lays it out. Then using his spacer block, again, he correctly placed it on the front edge and marked the length of said slots. Bringing the template to the bandsaw, I start to cut out the slot and realize the stops are catching on the bandsaw table, and I will need to turn it over and transfer my marks to the other side. When I see the stops, I realize my mistake and redo the layout on the underside of the template. Now that I've corrected my mistake, I remove the waste of the slot with the bandsaw and try to get it as perfect as I can. After removing much of the waste, I sanded the cutout down to the line and made sure it was nice and smooth, as it will have 2 functions, one to lay out the slot on the legs, and 2, cleaning up the slot at the router table. Using a template to lay out the slot on the legs, I bring the legs over to the bandsaw to cut out the slot. Here is where the less precise part of my nature shines through. Since I will be using the router and the template to finish the slot, all I have to do is keep the blade cutting on the inside of the line and roughly cut out the slot. I don't have to be straight, it just must be inside the lines, just like my elementary school art teacher told me to do. Who says you don't learn anything useful in school? As I mentioned previously, the template serves 2 purposes, and I'm about to use it for its second purpose. I love to use templates. They are the best way to make repeatable shapes, cutouts, and smoothing rough cuts. I have a previous video showing how templates and flush cutting router bits make parts production simple and repeatable. I will leave a link to that video below in the description. Check it out if you want to see more template routing in action. To smooth out the slots in the legs, I run the template along the sides and the back of the template, which cleans up the slot and makes them all identical. The router bit leaves round corners, so I take the legs over to the workbench and with a sharp chisel, I square all the corners. This gives me a chance to highlight my workbench, which was given to me by my father-in-law, who inherited the workbench from his father. This workbench is over 100 years old and still works, unlike my Ryobi drill and driver set. Then it was time to sand the legs, and I agree with everyone else, sanding is boring. Maybe the next time I have to sand something in this project I can read something at the same time. Well, we're gaining on it now. We are on the last glue up, the lower shelf. You know, I have been woodworking since I saw my first episode of the New Yankee Workshop on PBS in 1999. I have never had an interest in woodworking before then. I am a computer geek and have worked on, built, programmed, and configured computers since I was 14. Computers were the only thing I was good at, and I was happy with it. Then I discovered Norm Abram. He showed me how to build furniture, and he made it look so easy. Norm broke the projects down into simple to produce subassemblies using tools that I could get from the big box stores. One of the things he taught you is you cannot make a piece of furniture without straight and square parts. And if you have those, it is more likely that your project will come out correctly. That's why you see me cutting out the rough stock, then joining it, planing it, cutting it to square, and then assembling it over and over again until it becomes a finished project. Most woodworking is wash, rinse, and repeat, and don't forget to wear your safety glasses. This last glue up is just a simple edge glue up, no dominoes or biscuits. I place the boards on the cauls and spread the glue out on all the adjacent edges, laying them flat on the cauls and lightly clamping them together. I line up the boards as best as I can and put a second set of cauls on top of the boards to keep them aligned as flat as possible, and then start clamping everything up. I wrap the cauls up in saran wrap so the glue that squeezed out wouldn't bond the caul to the shelf. I also went a little overboard with the clamps, as the edge glue up always tends to move on me, and then I have to spend hours of sanding and scraping to make the glue up flat. As with the top, the shelf is not square, so using my track saw I cut off one edge as a reference cut, and then I was able to place that edge against the table saw fence and make the cuts that square up the shelf. I need to make a 45-degree cut on all four corners of the shelf, so once again I whipped out a little corner template out of MDF that will let me lay out the cut so I can rough cut it with a jigsaw. After all four cuts are made, I will take it over to the router table, and using the same corner template, I will use a flush cutting router bit to clean up those corner cuts. And once again, I'm sanding. Finally, we can prepare for the assembly of the table. The first step is to install the figure 8 fasteners that attach the legs to the table. Using a Forstner bit sized to the fastener, I drill into the legs about 1/8 of an inch. I install 2 per leg, one at the front and one at the back. Inserting the shelf into 2 of the legs to hold it up, I maneuver the remaining 2 legs into position. I then get my clamps ready. Using my soft mount to position the legs on the shelf, I move the legs until there is only about 1 inch of the slot open. This is where I will put a little glue to hold it all together. I don't want to glue the whole length of the slot, as that would lock the boards and not allow seasonal movement. I check the leg placement with my square, as I want the legs to be oriented at 45 degrees. This is very fussy work, but I finally got it to where I could get it to be clamped. Then I had to repeat the process for the other 2 legs. I went back and forth with this for a little bit, but once I was happy with all the leg orientations, I clamped the whole assembly up and let it cook into clamps until dry. After the glue was dry, I removed the clamps. Then I flipped the entire assembly over and centered it on the top. Once I had it where I wanted, I pre-drilled some pilot holes and then attached the top to the base with the screws. And that completed the assembly of the table. This was a fun project to build, and I hope you will try to build it in your workshop. So until next time, make it so.